Tonight history breathes softly beside dark water where empires fade, farmers sleep uneasily, and a river listens, ancient, patient, ready to decide who survives until dawn without asking anyone's permission. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. It is night along the Nile, sometime around the year 300 AD, and the river does not care what year it is, because time means very little to something that has already outlived so much. The moon hangs low and pale, its reflection stretched thin across the water, like something fragile, something that could snap at any moment if touched too roughly. The air is quiet in the way only deserts can manage, not empty, but heavy with stillness, as if sound itself has learned to walk softly here out of respect. Palm trees stand motionless along the banks, their shadows long and uneven, watching the river the way generations have always watched it, with respect, with fear, and with the tired patience of people who know they are never really in charge. Somewhere nearby, a village sleeps, or at least it tries to convince itself that it does. Mud brick houses huddle close together, roofs flat and dark, still holding the warmth of the day like a memory that refuses to fade. Inside them, farmers lie on woven mats, breathing slowly, bodies worn thin by sun and labor, muscles aching in familiar places, minds drifting between exhaustion and unease. Their eyes are closed because bodies must rest, even when certainty does not exist. The Niles are not. At night, the river becomes something else. During the day, it looks generous, even friendly, shimmering under the sun like a promise. By night, it turns opaque and secretive, its surface dark and unreadable. You cannot tell how fast it moves or how deep it truly is, and that uncertainty is part of its power. The Nile does not roar or thrash. It slides, it whispers, it keeps its violence polite. Crocodiles drift just beneath the surface, ancient and patient, their presence suggested only by a ripple that disappears too quickly to prove anything. Insects hum along the banks in a low, endless chorus, as if they are chanting for the river rather than against it. The water smells of life and decay at the same time, a combination the people here know well. Everything that feeds them comes from this river. Everything that can erase them does too. The farmers sleeping nearby understand this balance, even if they would never describe it in words like these. They have grown up with the Nile the way a child grows up with a difficult parent, one who provides food, structure, and routine, but who also has a temper and never explains it. These men and women rise before sunrise, work until their muscles feel hollow, and collapse into sleep, not because they are content, but because exhaustion leaves no room for thought. Sleep for them is not peace, it is maintenance. And even in sleep, the river remains present, audible through the open night, shifting and breathing, doing whatever it wants. The farmers may rest, but the Nile never clocks out. It does not need to. It is already permanent. The unsettling truth is that the river has a schedule, and the people do not control it. Every year, like an obligation written into the world itself, the Nile will rise. It will spill over its banks, flooding the fields, soaking the soil, leaving behind rich black silt that turns dust into farmland. This flood is the reason the village exists at all. Without it, the land would starve. With too much of it, the people would drown. And tonight, in the dark, no one can see what kind of year this will be. The water looks calm, it always does. That is part of the problem. The Nile is not dramatic when it prepares to ruin your life. It does not announce its intentions. It simply waits, and then it acts, and by morning, the rules may be different. There is a quiet irony here that the farmers would appreciate if they had the energy to laugh about it. They depend on the Nile completely, yet they trust it not at all. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every day survived is traced back to this river, and yet no one would ever call it kind. The Nile is generous, yes, but only on its own terms. It gives, but it never promises. It nourishes, but it never reassures. In this relationship, the river is both provider and authority, the source of life and the final judge. You could call it a father if that father were distant, unpredictable, and entirely uninterested in your opinion. You could also call it an employer, one who pays in food instead of coins and fires entire villages without warning. From the riverbank, the village looks small. From the river's perspective, it probably looks temporary. These houses have been rebuilt before. They will be rebuilt again. Floods have erased names, families, and memories here long before the Roman Empire decided this land was useful. The Nile has watched gods rise and fade, languages shift, rulers arrive with confidence and leave with excuses. It does not hurry, it does not adapt. It waits for humans to adapt to it, and when they fail, it keeps flowing anyway. This is what makes the silence so heavy at night. The calm is not comforting, it is indifferent. The water does not shimmer to soothe anyone. It reflects the moon because the moon happens to be there. Somewhere a farmer turns in his sleep. Perhaps he dreams of fields thick with grain, of a flood that arrives on time and leaves just enough behind. Perhaps he dreams of nothing at all. In a few hours he will wake, step outside, and look at the river as his father did, and his father before him. He will search the water for signs, for reassurance, for meaning. The river will offer none. It never does. It will simply be there, dark and steady, doing what it has always done. And that is the most unsettling part of all. The Nile does not need cruelty to be dangerous. It only needs to continue. Because if the Nile decides to rise too high or not high enough, if it shifts its mood by even a small margin, this quiet village could vanish. Before the sun has time to warm the mud walls, no warning, no negotiation. Just water, moving patiently through places where people used to sleep. And tomorrow morning, if the river is calm, everyone will call it a blessing. Tonight, it is just a reminder. The Nile is awake, and it is never required to be merciful. Who lives along this river? When morning eventually comes along the Nile, it does not arrive gently. The light creeps in low and sideways, slipping over the river first, then the fields, and finally the village, as if checking whether the people are still there. This is when you can see who actually lives along this water. Not kings, not generals, not the names carved into stone. What you see are farmers, men and women already moving before the sun fully commits, their silhouettes thin and practical, shaped by years of repetition. They are not impressive in the way history usually prefers. They do not wear crowns or speak in speeches. They bend, they lift, they wait. And in Roman Egypt, around 300 AD, that is most of the population. The empire may claim the land, the temples may claim the gods, but the riverbank belongs, in practice, to people whose hands are always dirty. These farmers are not poor in the dramatic sense. There are no constant cries, no theatrical misery. Their poverty is quieter than that. It is built into their routines. Their houses are small, made of mud brick mixed with straw, materials taken directly from the river's gifts, and returned to it when walls collapse and need rebuilding. Roofs are flat, furniture minimal, possessions few enough to carry if the water ever decides to reclaim the ground beneath them. Inside, families live tightly together. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all arranged around survival rather than comfort. Outside, animals share the same narrow spaces. Goats, donkeys, a few cattle if fortune has been kind, all dependent on the same water source, all equally vulnerable to its moods. The Nile does not discriminate between human and livestock. It feeds them together, and it can drown them together just as efficiently. These people are not pharaohs. That age is long past, though the stones still remember it. They are not priests either, despite how much religion surrounds them. They are not scribes, administrators, or Roman officials, even though Roman power presses down on them from far away, mostly through taxes and expectations. They are simply farmers. That word sounds harmless enough, almost comforting, until you realize how little flexibility it allows. Being a farmer here is not a calling. It is not a choice. It is an inheritance in the most literal sense. You are born into it, you learn it before you can read, and you perform it until your body can no longer keep up. If you are very lucky, your children will take over before you die. If you are less lucky, the river or hunger will intervene first. Everything they have is arranged around water. Fields stretch out from the river like careful calculations, divided into plots that only exist as long as the Nile behaves. Irrigation channels snake through the land, shallow and fragile, dug and maintained by hand. When the flood comes correctly, it fills them with life. When it does not, they become useless scars in dry soil. Homes are built just far enough from the river to avoid routine flooding, but close enough to access water daily. This balance is never perfect. It is guessed at, adjusted, argued over, and sometimes proven disastrously wrong. The river dictates the layout of the village, the timing of work, even the shape of the year itself. Seasons are not marked by temperature here, but by the river's rise and fall. Time is measured in water. Land ownership as a concept becomes strangely abstract in this place. On paper, the land belongs to Rome, or to wealthy estates, or to temples that trace their authority back centuries. In reality, the farmers work plots that are technically not theirs. They plant, tend, and harvest fields they do not own, fields that may change boundaries after every flood. The river redraws the map annually, depositing silt here, stealing soil there, shifting edges without asking permission. A farmer might work the same land his entire life and still understand deep down that he is borrowing it from the Nile, borrowing it from time. There is no deed that can protect against water. This borrowed existence creates a particular mindset. These farmers do not think in terms of progress. They think in terms of continuation. The goal is not to improve life, but to maintain it. To get through this year without disaster, to store enough grain, to keep enough animals alive, to avoid the attention of officials collecting taxes in kind, officials who do not care how difficult the harvest was, only how much is owed. Rome does not see individuals. It sees numbers, quotas, shipments of grain heading north to feed cities the farmers will never see. The irony is quiet but sharp. The people closest to the source of abundance live closest to hunger. Career ambition, as an idea, simply does not apply here. Children learn early what they will become, because they are already doing it. A boy helps his father in the fields. A girl learns household labor, food preparation, water carrying, tasks that never truly end. Occasionally, someone leaves, joins the army, becomes a laborer in a city. These stories are told carefully as exceptions, not expectations. Most people stay, not because they love the work, but because the alternatives are uncertain in a world where uncertainty is already the dominant condition. Stability, even a harsh one, has value. There is a dry humor buried in this reality, the kind that never quite reaches laughter. The farmers have very few career options. In fact, they have almost none. The river provides food, and in exchange, it takes freedom. You work where the water allows. You live where it permits. You survive if it agrees. The Nile is not interested in personal fulfillment. It does not reward creativity. It responds only to obedience and patience, and so the people along its banks learn to bend, literally and figuratively, shaping their lives around something that does not care whether they understand it or not. By mid-morning, the village is fully awake. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Children run barefoot over packed earth. Animals shift and complain. From a distance, it looks almost peaceful. From closer up, it is clear that peace here is conditional. Everything depends on the river continuing to behave as it did last year and the year before that. And no one along the Nile ever forgets that this is an arrangement, not a guarantee. The calendar of the water. By the time the sun climbs higher and the village settles into its daily rhythm, everyone's attention, whether openly acknowledged or not, turns back to the same question it always does. What kind of year will the river decide to be? The Nile, unlike the people who depend on it, keeps a schedule. It always has. Long before Roman administrators arrived with ledgers and laws, long before temples recorded rituals in stone, the river learned how to be predictable. Every year, fed by distant rains far to the south, it swells, rises, and spills over its banks. Not randomly, not impulsively, almost politely. It arrives on time with the confidence of something that knows the world has organized itself around its habits. To the farmers along its banks, this rhythm feels more reliable than any human promise. Empires fall, governors change, gods are renamed. The flood, however, keeps coming. This regularity is what makes life here possible at all. When the flood arrives at the right height, it spreads across the fields, soaking the soil and leaving behind a layer of dark, fertile silt as it recedes. This silt is not just dirt, it is food in potential form. It is grain waiting to happen. Without it, the land would harden into something closer to desert, and the farmers would be reduced to watching crops fail with depressing consistency. The flood is the great reset button of the year, erasing exhaustion and giving the soil another chance to cooperate. People talk about it the way others might talk about the weather, but with a seriousness that borders on reverence. When it comes on time at the right level, it feels almost miraculous, even though it happens nearly every year. Yet this miracle has precise requirements. Too little water, and the fields do not receive enough nourishment. The silt does not spread far enough. Crops sprout weak and thin if they sprout at all. Hunger follows quietly at first, creeping into homes as smaller portions, as stretched meals, as the unspoken understanding that something has gone wrong. Too much water, on the other hand, is not generous. It is catastrophic. Fields disappear beneath deep currents. Irrigation channels collapse. Homes near the river are swallowed. People and animals drown, not dramatically but efficiently. The flood does not aim to punish. It simply exceeds tolerance, and tolerance in this landscape is narrow. This delicate balance turns the flood into something like a living contract between the river and the people. The Nile agrees to rise, the farmers agree to wait. The Nile agrees to retreat, the farmers agree to plant. Everything works as long as both sides perform their roles. The problem, of course, is that only one side is capable of breaking the agreement without consequence. The river does not negotiate. It does not adjust based on need. It does not respond to prayers with explanations. It follows its cycle, driven by rains no one here can see, let alone control. From the perspective of the village, this makes the flood feel both dependable and deeply unfair. It arrives regularly, but it does not arrive kindly. Over generations, people have learned to measure the river with obsessive care. Water levels are watched, marked, remembered. Elders recall past floods the way others recall family tragedies. The year it barely rose. The year it took the fields. These stories are not nostalgia. They are warnings. They shape expectations and fears, setting the emotional tone for entire seasons. A good flood brings relief that borders on joy, though it is rarely celebrated loudly. A bad flood brings silence, calculation, and preparation for hardship. In this way, the Nile does not just water crops. It organizes emotion. It decides whether a year will be remembered with gratitude or dread. There is something almost comically modern about how much this sounds like a forecast. People wake, check the river, assess the situation, and adjust plans accordingly. The difference is that there is no forecast office, no expert reassurance, no margin for error. This is weather reporting, where the stakes are survival, and the data comes from watching water creep up a stone marker. Each inch matters. Each delay or surge is discussed in hushed tones. When the river rises smoothly, there is cautious optimism. When it hesitates, anxiety grows. When it climbs too fast, fear settles in like a physical weight. The calmness of the Nile's surface does nothing to soften this tension. If anything, it makes it worse. A violent storm can be understood. A quiet threat cannot. This tension defines the year more than any festival or decree. Planting is timed around it. Labor is planned around it. Even marriages and births are quietly influenced by whether the previous flood was kind or cruel. A good year means full granaries, healthier children, fewer desperate choices. A bad year forces compromises. Food is rationed. Seed grain may be eaten rather than planted. Animals are sold or slaughtered too early. None of these decisions are made lightly, but they are made often enough that people recognize the pattern. The flood is not just water. It is a test that repeats annually, and no one ever truly passes permanently. The unsettling part is how ordinary this feels to those living it. Children grow up understanding that some years are simply worse than others, that hunger is not a moral failure, that death, when it comes from water or lack of it, is not personal. The Nile does not single anyone out. It applies pressure evenly and lets chance decide who withstands it. From the outside, this might seem cruel. From within, it becomes normal. This normalization of risk shapes people into something quietly resilient, but also quietly resigned. They work, they wait, they watch, and they hope, all within a system that has no obligation to reward them. There is a faint irony in how precise the river's timing can be. It arrives so consistently that calendars are built around it, yet its consequences remain unpredictable. This reliability without security is what makes life along the Nile so psychologically demanding. You know the flood is coming. You just do not know what it will do to you. It is like living with a deadline that determines whether you will eat or starve, but never tells you the result in advance. Each year resets the anxiety, and each year people convince themselves that this time it will probably be fine. Most of the time they are right. Sometimes they are not. And when they are not, the river does not apologize. It does not explain itself. It does not slow down to see who is struggling. It flows, deposits, withdraws, and moves on. The fields once fertile may lie ruined. The village may lose people it cannot replace. Life continues anyway because it has to. The Nile's schedule remains intact, untouched by the consequences it leaves behind. That is the final tension beneath the calm surface. The river is dependable, but it is not accountable. It keeps perfect time, but it owes nothing to those who rely on it. The problem is simple, and it never changes. The Nile does not sign guarantee contracts with anyone. An ordinary day, if you're lucky. When the flood has done what it is going to do, when the water has receded enough to expose the fields again, life settles into what people here call a normal day, a phrase that quietly does a lot of work. A normal day begins before the sun makes any visible effort to rise. Darkness still clings to the edges of the village when the first movements begin. There is no alarm, no bell, no announcement. Bodies simply wake because they must. Sleep ends not when it feels complete, but when it stops being possible to afford. A farmer sits up, joints stiff, muscles already sore from yesterday, and prepares to repeat the same sequence of actions that has defined every working day of his life. Outside, the air is cool for a brief moment, and this brief moment is treated like a gift because everyone knows it will not last. Before light fully arrives, people are already moving toward the fields. Tools are gathered, simple things made of wood and stone and metal, worn smooth by hands rather than replaced. A plow is pulled by an animal that is just as tired as its owner. Hoes, sickles, baskets, all designed not for efficiency but for endurance. There is no machine to take over when the body fails. The body is the machine. It is expected to function repeatedly under heat, under strain, under conditions that would feel unreasonable if anyone involved had the luxury of arguing about it. By the time the sun finally clears the horizon, work is already well underway. This is not dedication. It is timing. You work early because later will be worse. As the sun climbs, the pace does not slow. Fields must be prepared, seeds planted or crops tended, irrigation channels cleared of debris left behind by the flood. Mud clings to feet, hands, clothing. Sweat becomes constant, a second skin. Conversation is minimal, not because people are unfriendly, but because talking costs energy, and energy is a resource carefully managed. Children help where they can, learning tasks by doing them, not by being instructed. There is no formal training for this life. Observation is enough. You watch, you copy, you repeat, and eventually your body learns the movements whether your mind is interested or not. Midday arrives without ceremony. The heat becomes heavier, pressing down rather than simply warming. Shadows shrink, offering less protection. This is when the work becomes less about productivity and more about persistence. Meals are small, practical, eaten quickly. Bread, onions, maybe a bit of beer, to dull thirst and hunger at the same time. No one lingers. Resting too long invites stiffness, and stiffness invites pain. The idea of a lunch break as something restorative does not exist here. Eating is just another task, another box to check before returning to the field. The sun does not pause. Neither can they. The tools themselves are blunt reminders of how little assistance the farmers receive. There are no innovations arriving to make this easier. The plow has looked the same for generations. The sickle cuts as it always has. Improvements, when they happen, are incremental and often unnoticed. Progress here is measured not in speed but in survival. A good tool is one that does not break when you need it most. A bad one is replaced only if replacement is unavoidable. Most of the work is done by hands and backs, by repetition rather than ingenuity. If something hurts, you adjust your posture. If it still hurts, you endure it. Pain is not treated as a warning. It is treated as a background condition. As the afternoon drags on, fatigue settles in more deeply. Movements become slower, heavier. Mistakes are more likely. A misstep in an irrigation channel, a slip of the blade, a moment of inattention can cost blood or worse. There is no safety margin built into this day. Accidents are absorbed into the rhythm of life the way hunger is. Someone gets hurt. Others compensate. Work continues. It has to. Crops do not wait for recovery. The Nile's schedule does not adjust for injury. The day does not care how tired you are. It only ends when the sun does. By late afternoon, the light softens slightly, but the heat lingers. Muscles burn with the dull ache of overuse. The body's energy is spent carefully now, rationed instinctively. This is when the idea of rest becomes almost humorous. Rest is not lying down. Rest is changing positions. It is straightening your back after hours of bending, feeling relief not because the work has stopped, but because it has shifted. This small mercy is enough to notice, enough to appreciate. In this world, comfort is relative, and relief comes in degrees so minor they would be invisible to anyone not trained to recognize them. As the sun finally lowers, the work does not immediately stop. There are tools to clean, animals to tend, water to carry. The village slowly reabsorbs its people, each returning from the fields coated in dust and sweat, moving with the careful stiffness of bodies that know tomorrow will ask the same of them. There is no sense of accomplishment attached to finishing the day. Finishing is expected. Surviving the day is the achievement, even if no one says it out loud. Dinner is prepared with the same efficiency as lunch, perhaps slightly larger if the year has been kind. Families gather, talk quietly, exchange observations about the fields, the water, the weather. These conversations are practical, not reflective. Philosophy is a luxury. Planning for tomorrow is not. Night falls quickly once it begins. Darkness returns, and with it, a temporary suspension of labor. People retreat indoors, not to relax in the modern sense, but to stop moving. Bodies lower themselves onto mats, muscles protesting, minds already slipping toward sleep. There is no entertainment to distract from exhaustion. Fatigue does the job well enough on its own. Children fall asleep easily. Adults follow, not because they feel done, but because they have nothing left to give. Outside, the river continues to move, audible in the quiet, reminding everyone that tomorrow's work depends entirely on what it decides to do next. There is no day off waiting at the end of the week. There is no structured pause built into the calendar for recovery. Festivals exist. Religious observances interrupt routine occasionally, but even these are shaped around agricultural necessity. You do not stop working because you are tired. You stop when the season allows it, and the season is controlled by water, not will. Rest here is not a reward. It is a brief absence of effort, measured in minutes rather than hours, taken whenever possible, and surrendered whenever necessary. This is what a normal day looks like along the Nile, assuming luck is on your side. No disasters, no failed crops, no sudden changes in the river's mood, just steady labor, predictable exhaustion, and the quiet understanding that this pattern will repeat tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that until something interrupts it. The irony is that this exhausting routine is what stability looks like. This is success. When nothing goes wrong, life becomes a long series of ordinary days like this one, each blending into the next, each sustained by the same river that could, at any moment, decide it has given enough. Food. Eating to survive, not to enjoy. When the day's labor finally loosens its grip and the village settles into evening, attention turns to food, not with excitement, but with calculation. Eating along the Nile is not an experience meant to delight the senses. It is a strategy, a way to convert effort into continuation. Meals are built around what is reliable, not what is desirable. Bread comes first, dense and coarse, made from emmer wheat, ground unevenly by stone. It fills the stomach without pretending to please it. Teeth wear down quickly from the grit left behind by primitive milling, but no one complains. Chewing is just another task, another reminder that even eating here requires work. Bread is life in its most literal form. If you have bread, you are still in the game. Alongside it comes beer, thick and cloudy, closer to liquid grain than anything modern drinkers would recognize. It is not consumed for pleasure, though a mild comfort may occasionally occur. Beer is nutrition disguised as a beverage, easier to digest than water that might carry disease, safer than trusting the river too much. Children drink it diluted. Adults drink it gratefully. It provides calories, hydration, and a small numbing effect that softens the edges of exhaustion. No one drinks to forget. They drink to endure. The idea of excess feels foreign in a place where tomorrow's supply is never guaranteed. Onions and beans complete the core of the diet. Onions are cheap, hearty, and strong enough in flavor to convince the mind that something interesting is happening. Beans provide protein when meat does not. Together they form the backbone of most meals, appearing again and again in slightly different combinations, seasoned lightly, if at all. Variety is not the goal. Consistency is. These foods grow well in the Nile's soil, store reasonably, and demand little imagination. That is their greatest strength. The people who eat them do not ask for novelty, they ask for enough. Meat exists, technically, but it is rare. Animals are valuable alive, providing labor, milk, or future offspring. Slaughter is a decision made reluctantly, often reserved for festivals, special occasions, or moments of desperation when survival demands it. When meat does appear, it is stretched as far as possible, shared widely, and remembered afterward. Sweet foods are even rarer. Honey exists. Dates are harvested when possible, but sugar as a concept of indulgence does not shape daily life. Pleasure here is accidental rather than planned. It happens when hunger briefly loosens its grip, not when someone decides to treat themselves. This limited diet creates a particular relationship with hunger. Hunger is not an emergency. It is the background noise of existence. Most people live just slightly hungry most of the time, bodies accustomed to operating below full satisfaction. Children learn early that feeling hungry does not mean food will appear immediately. Adults understand that appetite must be managed, ignored, or redirected. A full stomach is a temporary condition, often associated with a good flood year or a rare celebration. An empty or half-empty one is normal. This constant, low-level hunger sharpens awareness of food in a way abundance never could. Every bite is noticed, every shortage is felt. The pace of eating matches the pace of life. Meals are slow, not because people are savoring them, but because chewing takes effort, and energy must be conserved. There is no rush to finish, but no lingering either. Eating is practical, efficient, and quietly serious. Conversation continues, but it revolves around logistics: how much grain remains, how the fields look, whether the river seems higher or lower than last year. Food is discussed not as culture, but as supply. Recipes are inherited not for flavor, but for reliability. The best meal is the one that can be repeated tomorrow. This slow, repetitive nourishment shapes bodies in subtle ways. People are lean, not by choice, but by arithmetic. Calorie intake and output rarely align in comfort. Strength is built through labor rather than protein abundance. Illness hits harder when reserves are low. Recovery takes longer. Hunger makes people patient in some ways and irritable in others. It narrows focus. Big ideas feel distant when the body is negotiating with itself over energy. This is not misery in the dramatic sense. It is restraint imposed by environment, internalized over generations. In years when the flood is kind, food becomes slightly less tense. Portions increase. Anxiety loosens. People allow themselves small comforts, extra bread, an additional onion, perhaps even a piece of meat shared among many. These moments feel almost luxurious, not because they are extravagant, but because they temporarily suspend fear. Granaries fill enough to create the illusion of security. The illusion never lasts. Everyone knows this. Even during good years, the memory of bad ones lingers, shaping behavior. Food is stored carefully. Waste is unthinkable. Abundance is treated with suspicion. In bad years, the opposite happens quietly. Meals shrink without announcement. Beer thins. Bread stretches. Beans replace whatever little variety once existed. Hunger sharpens from background hum to constant presence. Children cry more often. Adults speak less. Decisions become harder. Do you eat seed grain now and risk next year, or save it and risk not surviving this one? These choices are not philosophical. They are immediate. They fracture households, test relationships, and expose inequalities that were easier to ignore when food was sufficient. Hunger is not just physical, it is social. This is where the slow erosion begins. When food becomes scarce, cooperation becomes fragile. Trust strains. People who once shared begin to calculate more carefully. Those with slightly more protected. Those with less notice. The village does not collapse all at once. It develops cracks. Small thefts occur, debts form, labor arrangements change. Social order, like the body, depends on steady nourishment. Without it, things weaken, gradually, almost politely, until the damage becomes undeniable. Food, then, is never just food along the Nile. It is stability, memory, and warning all at once. It tells people how well the river has treated them and how cautiously they should plan for what comes next. Eating to live, not to enjoy, creates a culture that values endurance over pleasure, foresight over satisfaction. It keeps people alive, but it also keeps them close to the edge, constantly aware of how thin the line is between enough and not enough. And when food truly fails, when the flood disappoints and the granaries empty, the consequences ripple outward. Hunger does not stay contained within the stomach. It moves into conversations, decisions, and power structures. It changes how people treat each other and how they respond to authority. This is the quiet truth beneath every simple meal of bread and onions. When food is no longer sufficient, society itself begins to crack. Top of form. Taxes, Rome, and those who never tilled the fields. By the time hunger begins to press a little harder, by the time meals become more cautious and conversation quieter, another presence makes itself felt along the Nile, one far less patient than the river and far more demanding. Rome does not arrive with armies every day. It does not need to. Its power is already embedded in paperwork, in schedules, in expectations that feel just as unavoidable as the flood. Egypt, by 300 AD, is no longer an independent world centered on its own gods and kings. It is a province, valuable not for its people, but for what grows from its soil. The Nile feeds grain into Roman mouths hundreds of miles away, and this single fact defines almost everything about life here. Egypt is not ruled to be admired. It is managed to be productive. The farmers know this even if they never see Rome. They feel it when officials arrive to measure fields and estimate yields. They feel it when scribes record numbers that do not reflect drought, illness, or exhaustion. They feel it most sharply when tax season comes, because taxes here are not paid in coins but in grain. Grain is life. Grain is food. Grain is survival. And yet grain is also obligation. Rome demands a portion of every harvest, and it demands it regardless of how generous the Nile happened to be that year. The logic is simple and merciless. The empire must be fed. The provinces exist to make that possible. This tax system turns the flood into something even more dangerous. A good flood means a good harvest, which means Rome expects more. A bad flood means a poor harvest, which means Rome still expects its share. The burden does not adjust downward easily. From the perspective of the farmer, the river's unpredictability is already enough to manage. Adding imperial accounting to the equation feels almost cruelly redundant. The land produces, the farmer works, and the grain flows north, filling state granaries and feeding cities that do not know the names of the people who grew their bread. The process is efficient, impersonal, and remarkably indifferent to local suffering. Roman officials rarely plow fields themselves. That work is beneath them, or at least safely delegated. They oversee, assess, and collect. They arrive with authority backed by law and, when necessary, force. Their presence is not constant, but it is enough to remind everyone who ultimately claims the harvest. The farmers may work the land, but ownership is theoretical at best. The grain belongs to Rome first. Whatever remains after taxes is what the people live on. This arrangement creates a quiet but persistent resentment, one that rarely explodes but never disappears either. There is a bitter irony in how essential Egyptian farmers are to the empire that exploits them. Rome depends on Egyptian grain to maintain stability. Urban populations cannot feed themselves. Soldiers cannot march on empty stomachs. Political order rests in part on the reliable flow of food from the Nile. And yet the people producing this abundance live with constant scarcity. They watch ships loaded with grain leave their region while their own meals shrink. The contrast is not lost on them. It simply feels unavoidable. Rome eats well. Egypt learns to live with hunger. Granaries stand as physical symbols of this imbalance. Massive structures, carefully guarded, filled with grain meant for export or redistribution elsewhere. To see them is to understand the system. Food exists, plenty exists. It is simply not for everyone. Farmers know that while their own stores run low, grain is being stockpiled nearby, destined for someone else's table. This knowledge adds a particular edge to hunger. It is not just absence, it is exclusion. The problem is not that the land cannot produce enough. The problem is who controls what it produces. The Roman administration does not consider this cruelty. It considers it governance. Taxes are framed as duty, as the cost of order and protection. Roads, laws, and relative stability are offered as justification. From a distance, this might seem reasonable. From the fields, it feels abstract. You cannot eat stability. You cannot feed your children with imperial ideology. What you can do is hand over grain and hope that what remains will be enough. Often it is not. This pressure reshapes rural life in subtle ways. Farmers become cautious to the point of anxiety. They hide grain when they can. They underreport yields if possible. They develop quiet strategies to survive within a system that leaves little room for error. These acts are not rebellion in the dramatic sense. They are survival tactics. Open resistance is rare and dangerous. Rome does not tolerate disruptions to its food supply. Punishments are severe enough to discourage widespread defiance. Most people comply resentfully, pragmatically, because the alternative is worse. Over time, this constant extraction drains resilience from the countryside. A single bad flood year might be survivable without taxes. With them, it becomes devastating. Families sell animals to meet obligations. Land changes hands. Debt accumulates. Some farmers become laborers on estates they once worked independently, trading autonomy for the promise of regular rations. The social fabric stretches thin, pulled by demands that never quite align with reality on the ground. Rome's system assumes consistency. The Nile does not provide it. What makes this situation especially unsettling is how normal it becomes. Children grow up watching grain leave their villages. They learn early that much of what they produce is not meant for them. This shapes expectations. It limits ambition. It teaches compliance. The idea that labor might lead to prosperity feels distant, almost naive. Work leads to survival sometimes. Beyond that, there are no guarantees. The empire benefits from this quiet resignation. An exhausted population rarely revolts effectively, and yet the system is not entirely stable. Hunger makes people unpredictable. When shortages become severe, when taxes feel especially unjust, tension surfaces. Complaints spread. Petitions are written. Occasionally violence flares, quickly suppressed but never fully erased from memory. Rome responds with adjustments, not mercy. Policies shift slightly, enforcement varies, but the core arrangement remains unchanged. Egypt feeds Rome. Rome rules Egypt. The farmers absorb the consequences. There is a dry humor in how Rome presents itself as civilized and advanced while relying so completely on the physical labor of people it barely acknowledges. Senators debate philosophy while Egyptian farmers debate whether to eat seed grain. Cities celebrate festivals while villages count remaining loaves. The contrast is stark, but it is also structurally invisible to those benefiting from it. Empires rarely feel the weight they place on others. They feel only their own hunger, and hunger at the center is far louder than hunger at the edges. As years pass, the accumulation of these pressures becomes part of the landscape, as familiar as the river itself. The Nile brings life. Rome takes a portion of it. The people adapt again and again, finding ways to survive within narrowing margins. This does not make them weak. It makes them cautious. It makes them pragmatic. It makes them acutely aware of how power operates when it does not have to see the faces of those it affects. In the end, the arrangement is brutally simple. The river provides. The farmers labor. Rome collects. Granaries fill far away. Plates here remain modest. No speeches are made about this reality. No monuments commemorate it. It simply persists, year after year, enforced by law and necessity. Rome eats its fill, confident in the strength of its system. Egypt, meanwhile, learns an intimate familiarity with hunger, not as a crisis, but as a condition. Rome is full, and Egypt, quietly, learns to live with less. God's superstition and the last hope. As the pressure of taxes, hunger, and labor settles deeper into daily life, something quieter but just as persistent rises to meet it. When control slips beyond human hands, belief fills the gap. Along the Nile, faith is not a philosophical position or a neatly organized system of doctrines. It is a reflex, a response to uncertainty. When you cannot predict the river, cannot argue with officials, cannot guarantee next year's harvest, you look elsewhere for leverage. You look upward, inward, anywhere that promises meaning where none is obvious. Gods, spirits, and rituals become tools, not because people are naive, but because despair without structure is harder to survive than faith with questions. The farmers do not pray because they are weak. They pray because the system they live in offers no reliable feedback loop. Effort does not always equal reward. Obedience does not ensure safety. Experience does not guarantee success. In such an environment, belief becomes a way to impose narrative on chaos. The Nile is not just water, it is divine. The land is not just soil, it is sacred. The seasons are not just cycles, they are expressions of will. When something feels alive and unpredictable, people treat it as alive, because that at least allows conversation, even if the answers never come. Gods of the river, gods of the earth, gods of fertility and harvest linger everywhere in thought and language. Even under Roman rule, even as official cults shift and new religious ideas circulate, older beliefs remain stubbornly present. They adapt, they merge, they survive. A prayer to the Nile might sit comfortably beside a Roman ritual, not because the farmer believes both equally, but because the farmer cannot afford to exclude any possible source of favor. When survival depends on forces beyond your influence, hedging your spiritual bets feels reasonable. Rituals are woven into the agricultural calendar with quiet precision. Before planting, offerings are made. During the flood, prayers intensify. After the harvest, gratitude is expressed carefully, not exuberantly, as if too much celebration might attract unwanted attention from forces that prefer humility. These practices are not dramatic. There are no grand epiphanies. There is repetition. Words spoken softly, gestures repeated year after year, actions performed not because anyone expects miracles, but because doing nothing feels worse. Religion here functions less as comfort and more as structure. It gives shape to anxiety. It provides explanations when logic fails. If the flood is too low, perhaps the gods are displeased. If it is too high, perhaps they are angry. These interpretations may not solve the problem, but they give it a cause, and causes can be addressed even symbolically. Offerings can be increased. Rituals can be corrected. Behavior can be adjusted. The idea that something went wrong for a reason is easier to carry than the idea that nothing has meaning. There is a faint eeriness in how calmly people accept divine indifference. The gods, like the river, are not expected to be kind. They are expected to be powerful. Appeasement matters more than affection. A God who always rewards would be suspicious. A God who demands respect and offers uncertainty feels more realistic. This worldview aligns perfectly with the lived experience of the Nile. It rises, it falls, it nourishes, it destroys. It does not explain itself. Why should the gods behave any differently? Children absorb this atmosphere early. They learn which days are sacred, which actions are forbidden, which words should be spoken carefully. They see adults pray not with theatrical emotion, but with practiced seriousness. Faith is not ecstatic. It is disciplined. It is another form of labor performed alongside farming, cooking, and carrying water. Just as you maintain irrigation channels, you maintain relationships with the divine. Neglect feels dangerous. Excess feels risky. Balance is everything. This spiritual life does not eliminate fear, it organizes it. Storms, floods, illness, and hunger remain terrifying, but they become part of a larger story. When someone dies young, when a crop fails, when taxes crush a family beyond recovery, the explanation may not satisfy, but it stabilizes. The gods wanted something. The gods tested us. The gods turned their faces away. These phrases do not heal wounds, but they prevent the mind from collapsing under randomness. They allow grief to coexist with routine. There is also a subtle social function to belief. Shared rituals reinforce community. When everyone gathers to pray for the flood, the act itself becomes a reminder that suffering is collective. No one faces the river alone. Even if the gods remain silent, the village does not. This shared vulnerability builds a fragile solidarity, one that hunger and taxation may strain but rarely erase completely. Faith becomes a glue holding people together when material conditions pull them apart. At the same time, religion can feel like the last line of defense against despair. When all practical measures have failed, when there is no grain left to hide, no animals left to sell, prayer remains available. It costs nothing but hope. That makes it powerful. Even the most skeptical farmer will whisper something toward the river when the water rises unpredictably. Doubt is a luxury, reserved for those with options. Along the Nile, options are scarce. The tone of belief here is not triumphant, it is cautious. There is no assumption that prayers will be answered favorably. There is only the belief that not praying would be worse. This creates a quiet tension, an unsettling calm in which people perform rituals without expectation, hoping not for miracles but for moderation. Not abundance, not greatness, just enough. Enough water, enough grain, enough mercy to get through another year. From the outside, this faith might look like superstition. From the inside, it is strategy. It is how people cope with a world that refuses to explain itself. When nature cannot be controlled, it is negotiated with. When power cannot be challenged, it is interpreted. When suffering cannot be avoided, it is given meaning. None of this makes life easier. It makes it bearable. As night falls again along the Nile, prayers drift quietly into the darkness, spoken without witnesses, offered without guarantees. The river listens or it does not. The gods respond or they remain silent. Either way, the people will wake tomorrow and return to their fields. Faith does not change the schedule. It changes the way people endure it. And in a place where endurance is the primary skill required for survival, that may be reason enough to believe. One wrong flood. Everything falls apart. It only takes one wrong year, not a dramatic year, not a year of legends or catastrophes sung about later, but a slightly wrong one. A year when the flood arrives too late or rises unevenly or withdraws too quickly, leaving behind land that looks familiar but behaves differently. At first, nothing seems broken. The river still flows. The fields are still there. People go through the motions because that is what they have always done. But beneath the surface, the system begins to slip, quietly, almost politely, the way old structures tend to fail. Along the Nile, collapse rarely announces itself. It unfolds. The flood that year does not behave as expected. It hesitates. It rises unevenly, blessing some fields and neglecting others. In certain places, the water spreads thin, leaving soil damp but not nourished. In others, it lingers too long, rotting seedlings before they have a chance to take hold. Farmers notice these things immediately. They do not need measurements or reports. Their bodies recognize trouble before their minds fully accept it. Conversations change tone. Optimism becomes cautious. People say less, they watch more. Everyone senses that the margin for error has narrowed, even if no one says it aloud. As the season progresses, the consequences become harder to ignore. Crops grow unevenly. Some plots yield less than expected. Others fail entirely. This does not create panic right away. The Nile has disappointed before. People adjust. They stretch supplies. They tell themselves that next year will be better. But this year is still happening, and it demands to be survived. Granaries that should be filling remain half empty. The absence of grain is not immediately visible, but it is felt in smaller meals, in careful accounting, in the way people linger a moment longer over storage jars, calculating how many days they might last. Hunger deepens from background presence to active force. Children become thinner. Illness lingers longer. Bodies already strained by labor lose resilience. A minor sickness that might have passed in a good year now becomes dangerous. Coughs turn persistent. Fevers take longer to break. Without adequate food, recovery slows, and weakness spreads quietly through the village. There is no dramatic outbreak, no single moment of crisis, just an accumulation of small failures, each one manageable on its own, but devastating in combination. As hunger sharpens, behavior shifts. People begin to protect what little they have more aggressively. Sharing becomes cautious. Trust, once taken for granted, starts to feel expensive. Doors are secured more carefully at night. Storage areas are checked repeatedly. The village does not descend into chaos, but it tightens like a muscle held under strain for too long. Small thefts occur, at first dismissed as misunderstandings. A missing loaf, a jar that seems lighter than it should be. No one wants to accuse anyone else. Accusations would fracture what little stability remains. Eventually, suspicion becomes unavoidable. When survival feels uncertain, Morality becomes flexible. People justify actions they would have condemned in better times. Taking a little extra feels necessary. Looking away feels easier than confronting the reality that hunger is turning neighbors into competitors. This is not villainy. It is pressure. Social order along the Nile has always been built on cooperation, but cooperation requires surplus. When surplus disappears, the structure weakens. Roman taxes do not pause for this unraveling. Grain is still demanded. Officials still arrive. Their expectations do not align with the reality on the ground, but alignment has never been their priority. This compounds the crisis. Families forced to meet obligations sell what they can, including tools and animals that would help them recover later. Short-term survival undermines long-term stability. Each compromise solves one problem by creating another. The future is quietly mortgaged to survive the present. Small acts of resistance begin to appear, tentative and disorganized. A shipment delayed, a measure disputed. A group of farmers refusing briefly to comply fully. These are not rebellions in the heroic sense. They are expressions of exhaustion. They flare up and fade quickly, met with warnings or force, enough to remind everyone where power truly lies. The message is clear. Hardship does not exempt anyone from obligation. The empire is fed first. The countryside adjusts or suffers. Disease finds fertile ground in this weakened environment. Crowded homes, poor nutrition, and stress create conditions where illness spreads more easily. There is no medical response capable of addressing it effectively. Remedies are improvised. Prayers intensify. Deaths increase not suddenly, but steadily. Each loss is absorbed quietly, marked by ritual, then folded into daily routine. There is no time to grieve fully. The living have too much to manage. What makes this year especially unsettling is how normal it looks from the outside. The river still flows. The fields are still green in places. The village still exists. There is no single moment you could point to and say, this is when everything fell apart. Instead, there is a gradual erosion of confidence. People stop planning beyond the next few weeks. Marriages are delayed. Children are put to work earlier. Dreams shrink. Expectations narrow. Life becomes reactive rather than aspirational, focused entirely on managing damage rather than building anything new. Social hierarchies strain under this pressure. Those with slightly more resources retreat inward, protecting their households. Those with less become more desperate. The gap between them, once manageable, grows sharper. Resentment builds quietly. It does not explode. It settles, heavy and unresolved. Community gatherings become tense. Conversations avoid certain topics. Everyone knows who is struggling more, and everyone knows there is little to be done about it. Faith, too, begins to feel strained. Prayers continue, but they carry a different weight now, less hopeful, more pleading. When the gods do not respond, doubt creeps in, not as open disbelief, but as exhaustion. People keep performing rituals because stopping feels dangerous, not because belief feels strong. The river remains indifferent. The gods, like the empire, offer no explanations. Silence becomes part of the landscape. As months pass, the cumulative effect becomes undeniable. The village is still standing, but it is thinner, quieter, more brittle. The social bonds that once absorbed stress now transmit it. One more shock could push things too far. Everyone senses this, even if they cannot articulate it. The year has not destroyed the community outright. It has weakened it, leaving it vulnerable, like a riverbank after too much erosion. When the next flood approaches, anticipation is no longer hopeful. It is anxious. People look to the water not with expectation, but with apprehension. They know how little margin remains. A good flood might stabilize things. Another bad one could finish what this year started. The uncertainty hangs over everything, shaping behavior, draining energy, flattening emotion. This is how collapse often looks in real life. Not sudden, not spectacular, but slow, quiet, and deeply unsettling. One wrong year is enough to remind everyone how fragile the world along the Nile truly is. Born, grow up, die, all here? When life stabilizes again, if it ever truly does, it settles back into patterns that feel ancient, unchangeable, and quietly final. Along the Nile, existence unfolds in a loop rather than a line. People are born, they grow, they work, they weaken, and they die, often within sight of the same stretch of water. Movement is limited. Ambition is narrow. The river does not encourage reinvention. It rewards continuity. From the moment a child takes their first steps on packed earth, the shape of their life is already visible, not as a prophecy, but as a practical consequence of where they were born. Birth itself is an uncertain beginning. Many children do not survive infancy. Illness, hunger, and accidents claim lives early, and families learn not to celebrate too loudly, too soon. A child who survives the first years is slowly absorbed into the rhythm of labor. There is no clear boundary between childhood and adulthood. As soon as small hands can carry water, scare birds, or help with planting, they are expected to do so. Work is not introduced as responsibility. It is introduced as normal. Play exists, but it happens around labor, not instead of it. The fields are both classroom and future. Parents do not speak often about what their children might become. The question rarely arises. A son learns to farm because his father farms. A daughter learns domestic and agricultural tasks because her mother does. Skills are passed down through observation and repetition, not instruction manuals or formal teaching. Knowledge here is physical. It lives in muscle memory, in timing, in knowing how the soil should feel in your hands after the flood has receded. This knowledge is valuable, but it does not travel far. It ties people to place, to the riverbank, to a way of life that does not offer exits. As children grow into adults, their expectations remain modest. Survival becomes the primary goal, eclipsing any abstract notion of success. A good year is one where no one starves. A great year is one where grain stores last through the next planting season. Dreams, in the modern sense, do not fit well into this environment. They require excess energy, time, and optimism, all of which are in short supply. Instead, people focus on endurance. The hope is not to become something else, but to remain what they are for another year. Marriage happens early, often driven by practicality rather than romance. Households need labor. Children need caretakers. Partnerships are formed to distribute work and risk. Love may grow, but it is not the foundation. Survival is. New families establish themselves close to existing ones, reinforcing the tight geography of village life. Space is limited. Movement is discouraged by necessity. The river anchors everyone in place, and social structures form around that immobility. Adulthood is defined by work and repetition. Days blur into seasons. Seasons blur into years. The body becomes the calendar, marking time through scars, aches, and fatigue. People age faster here not because time moves differently, but because it presses harder. By middle age, many farmers already carry injuries that never fully heal. Backs curve, hands stiffen, vision weakens. There is no retirement waiting. Work continues as long as the body allows it. When it no longer does, dependence shifts from productivity to family support, if family remains. Old age, when reached, is a quiet achievement. Elders are respected not for wisdom in the abstract, but for survival. Living long enough to see multiple flood cycles is proof of competence. Stories are told not to entertain, but to instruct. Tales of bad years, of mistakes made, of floods gone wrong, serve as informal guides for younger generations. Memory becomes another tool for survival. Even so, the elderly do not hold power. They advise, they observe, they wait. The river does not grant authority based on age. Death arrives without ceremony beyond ritual necessity. Funerals are simple, grief is real but constrained. The living cannot afford prolonged mourning. Fields still need tending, animals still need care. The cycle does not pause, a life ends, and the space it occupied is filled quickly, often by a child, stepping into new responsibilities sooner than expected. Loss is absorbed into routine, becoming part of the ongoing calculation of survival. What defines this entire life cycle is its lack of deviation. Very few people along the Nile dramatically change their circumstances. Social mobility exists in theory, but rarely in practice. A farmer's child becomes a farmer not because of tradition alone, but because alternatives require resources and connections beyond reach. The river shapes not only the land, but the imagination. When your world is bounded by water, fields, and obligation, thinking beyond it feels unnecessary, even risky. There is a quiet resignation in this acceptance, but also a kind of clarity. People do not spend their lives chasing identities they cannot reach. They focus on what is in front of them. The future is not an open horizon. It is a narrow path, well worn, with known dangers. The goal is to walk it without falling. In this context, ambition is not expansion. It is continuity. Children grow up watching their parents age, weaken, and eventually disappear, and they understand, without explanation, that this will happen to them too. This knowledge is not traumatic. It is normalized. Life here does not promise more than it delivers. It is harsh but honest. The river never pretends that everyone will rise. It simply offers the same test to each generation and waits to see who passes long enough to pass it on. This is why the idea of choosing who you want to be never truly takes root. Choice implies flexibility. Flexibility implies surplus. Along the Nile, surplus is rare and temporary. No one asks a child what they want to become when they grow up, because the answer would be impractical. The river has already decided the shape of the answer. You will become what this land requires you to be. You will work, you will wait, you will hope the water behaves, and if you are lucky, your children will do the same. Who you want to be is a question for places where the environment does not dictate survival so completely. Here, identity is inherited, reinforced, and maintained by necessity. The Nile does not negotiate identities, it assigns them, and generation after generation accepts this arrangement, not because it is inspiring, but because it is real. No one asks you what you want to become. The Nile already answered that question the day you were born. The river still flows. Night returns to the Nile the same way it always has, quietly, without ceremony. indifferent to everything that unfolded during the day. The river darkens again, its surface smoothing out as if nothing of consequence has ever happened here. Moonlight stretches across the water in a thin, trembling line, just as it did centuries ago, just as it will centuries from now. The village settles into sleep once more, houses dim, voices gone, bodies exhausted. Somewhere nearby someone breathes their last. Somewhere else a child stirs in sleep, already moving toward a life they did not choose. None of this alters the river's course. The Nile does not pause to observe. It continues. Standing at the riverbank at night, it becomes easier to understand how small everything else is. The fields, the villages, even the empires that claimed this land all feel temporary when measured against water that has flowed this way longer than memory. Rome rules now, or at least it thinks it does. Its officials count grain and enforce laws, confident in systems that seem permanent. But the river has seen this confidence before. It watched pharaohs carve their names into stone with similar certainty. It watched priests promise eternity. It watched kingdoms rise, stabilize, fracture, and vanish, leaving behind ruins half swallowed by sand and silt. The Nile absorbed them all into its margins without changing pace. The farmers sleeping near its banks will never see this full arc of history. They do not need to. Their lives are measured differently in seasons rather than centuries, yet they are part of the same pattern. They work, they suffer, they endure, and eventually they disappear, replaced by others who will repeat the same motions. Names fade, faces blur. The labor continues. Empires extract. Gods are invoked. Rituals performed. Taxes collected, children born. Through it all, the river flows, carrying fragments of every era downstream, blending them into something indistinguishable. There is a strange comfort in this continuity, though it is not a warm one. The Nile does not promise improvement. It does not offer justice. It does not reward virtue or punish cruelty consistently enough to draw conclusions. It simply exists. That existence becomes the only truly stable element in a world defined by uncertainty. People adapt to it because they must. They shape their lives around it because resisting it is pointless. In doing so, they surrender a certain amount of agency, trading freedom for predictability, even when that predictability includes danger. At night, the unsettling calm of the river feels almost intentional. During the day, its importance is obvious. At night, it feels like something else entirely, something older, something watching without interest. The water reflects stars that will outlast every human story told along its banks. Crocodiles drift silently. Insects hum. The sounds are small, continuous, hypnotic. It is easy to imagine that if all human activity stopped tomorrow, the Nile would not notice. Fields would flood and dry. Plants would grow and die. The cycle would continue, uninterrupted by absence. This perspective makes human struggles feel both tragic and faintly absurd. So much effort is spent negotiating with forces that cannot be persuaded. So much suffering accumulates. In response to conditions that do not remember those who suffer, empires fight over control of resources that will outlive them. Officials enforce policies as if they are permanent solutions. Farmers exhaust their bodies year after year for harvests that might fail regardless. And yet, none of this alters the fundamental arrangement. The river gives when it gives. It takes when it takes. There is a quiet irony in how deeply people invest meaning into this water. They pray to it, they fear it, they organize entire societies around it. They assign it moral weight, divine intention, even personality. In return, it offers consistency without compassion. This is not cruelty. It is indifference. The river does not wake up angry. It does not decide to be generous. It follows patterns shaped by distant rains and gravity, processes far removed from the lives depending on them. Meaning is projected onto it because humans require meaning to survive psychologically. The Nile requires nothing. As centuries pass, Rome will weaken. Its administrative grip will loosen. New powers will rise. New religions will reinterpret the river's significance. New villages will form, and old ones will vanish beneath shifting banks. Languages will change. Borders will be redrawn. The names of gods will be forgotten or merged into new stories. None of this will register as disruption to the river. It will continue to flood, recede, nourish, and destroy with the same measured patience. The scale of human time simply does not apply here. For the people living along its banks, this reality produces a particular kind of humility, not the kind celebrated in philosophy, but the practical kind born of necessity. You do not challenge what you cannot escape. You adapt, you endure, you hope for moderation. Extreme outcomes, whether good or bad, are unsettling. Stability, even harsh stability, is preferred. This preference shapes behavior, culture, belief, and identity over generations. The river teaches restraint, not through instruction, but through consequence. As the night deepens, the village sleeps fully now. Dreams, if they come, are simple. Fields intact. Water rising just enough. Children surviving. These dreams are not ambitious. They are specific. They align perfectly with the narrow band of conditions that allow life here to continue. In this way, hope itself becomes calibrated to the river. People do not hope for abundance. They hope for balance. They hope the Nile behaves within acceptable limits. They hope to be among the lucky ones. Because luck, more than virtue or effort, determines outcomes here. A farmer can do everything right and still lose everything. Another can make mistakes and survive because the flood was kind. This randomness is not hidden. It is acknowledged quietly in the way people talk, plan, and pray. It tempers pride. It limits blame. It also erodes the idea that life can be mastered. Along the Nile, life is managed, not controlled. Eventually, the night thins. The horizon lightens almost imperceptibly. The river looks the same as it did hours ago, days ago, centuries ago. It waits for no one, yet it supports countless lives. Tomorrow it will continue its cycle. It will rise or fall according to patterns far beyond this village, and people will wake, step outside, and look at it once more, searching for reassurance in a surface that offers none. That is how it has always been here. The river does not mark endings. It does not commemorate lives. It does not remember empires. It simply moves forward, carrying everything with it or leaving it behind as needed. Human stories begin and end along its banks, layered over one another, temporary and intense. The Nile remains calm, deep, unsettling in its permanence. Tomorrow the river will rise again. And someone somewhere along its edge will look at the water and hope they are lucky enough to survive what comes next.